And now I'm happy to welcome our next speaker, Crystal Legacy, who is Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Melbourne, Australia, where she's also the Deputy Director of the Informal Urbanism Research Hub. She resides in Wurundjeri country, where she writes, teaches, and works with communities on issues related to urban transport politics, public participation, and the post-political city. She publishes in a range of academic journals, provides critical commentary on local and national media outlets, and works in solidarity with a range of community-based groups seeking climate-just outcomes in transport planning. Crystal is an editor of 2 journals, Planning Theory and Practice and Urban Policy and Research, and is the inaugural chair of the Australasian Early Career Urban Research Network. Crystal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up? Perfect, excellent. I want to send my apologies for not joining you in Ljubljana this week. I would have loved to have been there. I'm currently in Canada, in Toronto, visiting my family after a very long series of international border closures in Australia, where I call home. So I had to take up that opportunity to see my family for the first time in several years. But I do send my well wishes to you all, and I very much look forward to the conversation we're going to have together over the next 90 minutes. I have been attending all the sessions up until this point, and I have been inspired. I have been provoked by the incredible thought-provoking presentations from Robin, Eric, Patrick, and Peter. And I hope that my presentation will build on some of the themes that have emerged over the last day and a half. And in particular, I will kind of contribute to and hopefully advance in some modest way the call that Patrick sent out to all of us in terms of what role we might play as researchers, as scholars, and as educators around energy transitions, or about sort of social transformation in this very difficult time we find ourselves in. My research looks at the intersection and interface between the politics of transport planning and infrastructure planning, as well as the politics of public participation. I draw from a range of different theoretical spaces, early on from the work of Jürgen Habermas, then merged into or evolved into looking into the work of Chantal Mouffe around agonism and agonistic pluralism. And now I kind of situate myself in the post-foundationalist kind of space around post-democracy and the post-political city. The work that I'm going to present today it kind of sits on that foundation of work that I've derived and generated over the last 10 years of my academic career. But where I hope to take this presentation, this conversation, is into a space that is relatively new for me. And kind of, in many ways, like you, thinking about this critical period, this critical decade we are in, what role can we play as researchers, as scholars, as as teachers? And I'm starting to think through what are the roles for cultivating political pathways and possibilities, and what are the conditions for change, and how might we as academics do work in that space. So very much I'm going to start from a position of what is my positionality. I will read my presentation. I like to try to tell a story when I present. I do have a slideshow as well, and those slides are mostly images, and hopefully they'll help provoke and inspire a conversation when we open the floor to that. So let me just share my screen. This is always the moment when I'm most nervous. So I hope everyone can see that. Okay, so I assume that's a yes. I haven't heard anyone say anything otherwise. So again, thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. And before I go any further at this point, I just want to acknowledge the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I live, write, and conduct my advocacy work, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also present to you today from the traditional territory of the custodians of the lands in Southern Ontario, where my family is located. And I draw inspiration from the different lands that sustain my life. And I'm committed to an embodied learning of how to care for country, which these lands ask of me. This cause includes reflecting on my own positionality with respect to the many places, people, and work that I am in relationship with, and to think about my academic practice as one of personal, epistemological, and ontological unsettling. This practice of unsettling is where I situate myself in relationship to this talk. I'd also like to acknowledge the collaborators I have had the great pleasure of working with, and today especially acknowledge the work of Rebecca Clements, who co-wrote the paper with me that sets the grounding for this talk today. And I also acknowledge the community groups that have invited me into their spaces of advocacy and activism. These are groups who are reimagining new cities, different planning practices, and charting new political possibilities. And they are practicing what Rebecca Solnit describes as new politics for change, which he says is already here. So like Eric's presentation yesterday, where we are already sitting within the apocalypse, Rebecca Solnit is lamenting and arguing that perhaps we are also sitting in a time of great hope as well. And it's about how do we engage with that hope? How do we see it? How do we nurture it? How do we universalize it, perhaps? And particularly as researchers, how do we pare away the barriers that lie ahead to extend those moments of hope and those periods of hope into greater spaces? So grounding Rebecca Solnit's publication to transport planning, where I spend a lot of my time thinking and writing, I join my collaborators in asking what counts in the planning for future transport and mobility. So what counts? And importantly, who is doing the counting? In the context in which I learn, teach, study, and write, transforming the dominant forms of mobility in Australian cities where I situate myself is imperative to achieving sustainable and equitable cities elsewhere. Yet much of transport planning and infrastructure delivery remains opaque and mismatched to public needs and to place context. So linking to Patrick's presentation earlier on around that relationship between infrastructure and place. So the work of paring away what obscures that change, our work as scholars may be to engage in this effort through critical and political academic practice. And that's the crux of my argument today. Yet to do this political work of situating scholarship, including how it is conducted and for whom it serves, is to acknowledge that contemporary transport and transport infrastructure planning occurs in a paradoxical landscape. On the one hand, the ethical responsibility of planning is to make cities and regions more accessible to diverse populations. Improving accessibility, which is one of the main bodies of work in transport planning, to urban places and services is not only about social equity, as important and as complex as that is, it is also deeply connected to the capacities for human flourishing. And ostensibly, the planning for social and spatial equity and to enable flourishing, and my friend and colleague Sophie Stirrup writes about this idea of human flourishing as integral to planning, is to practice planning in a way that serves the public interest, put it into quotation marks, and in a way that intentionally and critically reflects upon the ethical complexities of the public interest landscape. On the other hand, transport planning is conducted within a landscape where powerful commercial interests are brought to bear on decisions about mobility and accessibility. The public interest claims, despite their contentious nature, and we can argue and debate what public interest is, and despite their contentious nature and the need for careful critical scrutiny, are often framed through the prism of what has been described by post-foundational scholars as, and Eric Swingadu discussed this yesterday, empty signifiers. So these grand words such as sustainability, livability, even participatory planning, and the call for jobs creation and the privileging of economic productivity are often these claims, these cries, these commitments, these normative goals that rarely get tested by and within the planning system, which is otherwise, particularly in neoliberal democratic contexts, are beholden to the interests of capital. So the weight of neoliberalism, of privatization, and in the Australian context, I'd argue the corporatization of planning has not just limited the spaces for public dialogue about the problems facing cities and about the social, spatial, and cultural harms attached to mega rent-seeking projects like toll roads. Planning is bounded. Where planning and participation does occur, it is shaped by limiting what counts, what conversations are had, when, how, and where, and who is determining those spaces, and ultimately who is doing the counting. Grounding this paradoxical landscape in the empirical context where I conduct my research, which is in Melbourne, Australia, I offer the following to you. In 2009, Australian academic Jago Dodson described strategic spatial planning as having encountered the infrastructure turn. And more recently, Australian academics Dallas Rogers and Chris Gibson described the formalization of public-private partnerships as a kind of unsolicited urbanism, whereby democratic public participation in infrastructure governance is displaced through closed-door elite deal-making. So we're seeing an evolution of neoliberalism away from perhaps public and private partnerships whereby there's a privatization of infrastructure, or perhaps there's a commitment towards competition within the marketplace. What we're seeing now are elite actors within the private sector dominating those spaces of competition and winning out on tenders and opportunities for infrastructure production and growth in cities like Melbourne. So they are calling it this idea of unsolicited urbanism, whereby private sector entities are actually, through unsolicited means, pitching projects that they can then argue address some kind of public interest gap. So the privatization of transport infrastructure assets has fragmented Australian urban planning, and the policy settings of the past 20 years have done little to curtail the worst outcomes this has produced. These trends have had serious consequences for transport planning, as observed in recent independent reports, as on my slide. And for instance, a Victorian Auditor General's Office report critiqued the state of Victoria's strategic transport planning as being fragmented and highly ineffective, and citing the absence of an integrated transport plan. The Victorian state government was in breach of its responsibility to produce a plan, to produce a vision for infrastructure investment decisions under state legislation. In this case, it's called the Integrated Transport Act of 2010. So in the current state of Victoria, while there is an abundance of infrastructure being road and rail infrastructure being built, it is doing so at a time when there is actually no strategic ambition, at least one that is known and understood and seen and made visible within the public sphere. So while independent reports critique the state of transport planning are not rare, they are joined by independent critical assessments by think tanks and urban transport academics. Together, these independent reports and academic studies cast attention onto what is at stake for transport policy in Australian cities, and perhaps offer insight into what the Australian model of transport infrastructure provision can have for cities elsewhere. The continued use of exclusionary decision-making processes, opaque managerial governance settings, and elite actors subverting strategic planning, all of which taken together put at risk planning's capacity to act in the public interest, thus deepening the politics of exclusion, amplifying corporate power, and extending spatial inequality. Critically, the public interests in planning include collective responses to the climate emergency, as we discussed today and yesterday, as well as tackling the structural, social, and spatial inequalities of the kind that mobility scholar Mimi Scheller writes about. For decades, critical planning scholars and scholarship have lamented neoliberalism's ability to remove, and in many instances, to conceal the political from planning's content. So taking cues from post-foundational scholarship, particularly the work of Jacques Rancière, the post-political condition of urban transport infrastructure planning, described by UK and Australian scholars Graham Horton and Phil McManus, is where the state is designed with techno-managerial processes that render planning otherwise depolitical. So in other words, the state forecloses the political in traditional or formal planning arenas, meaning that the political must find new spaces to be expressed. Where we see the political emerge is in the context of street protests, and in other cases as informal, people-led planning, which aesthetically may resemble community meetings, where the nature of power is centered on the everyday lived experiences of people and the motivations that bring people into these more informal politicizing venues and spaces is to build power, extend power from the grassroots outward, shape the conversation, frame the conversation, and impact change. The depoliticization of transport planning is achieved by design. As scholars Graham Horton and Phil McManus, as well as Australian political scientist James Murphy argue, it is achieved through the privileging of technical and managerial competencies and the capacities of elite actors to control the narratives of transport policy and frames through which transport projects are then justified. So the foreclosing of the political in transport planning extends across practice, policy, and procedural landscapes. And it is systematic in its ability to control the frames and ways of knowing available to transport planners. And this is written up by transport scholars Louise Reardon and Greg Marsden. So in these neoliberal and increasingly corporatized spaces, gatekeeping is an expression of hegemonic power. In transport planning, this involves dictating what counts as transport planning, and it includes what ways of knowing transport problems and solutions count. So what kinds of problems and what kinds of solutions are deemed countable in the context of these sort of post-political landscapes. And it's what certain knowledge systems and which knowledge systems are deemed legitimate in the face of the challenges that we are confronted with. So the gatekeeping of power extends to what Christina Grange, who is writing in the context of Norwegian planning, cautious, is the impact of planners' ability to speak fearlessly. So this is one of the impacts of these depoliticized and post-political conditions around planning, is the inability of planners to speak fearlessly in their roles as public planners, which is impacting planners' ability to speak to the social, cultural, economic, and ecological impacts of decisions and to advocate for just processes and outcomes. So here we have an image of someone, Tim Williams, who sat on a committee, the Committee for Melbourne, which oversees a lot of development and visioning and strategy for metropolitan Sydney, having been sort of disciplined, so to speak, in terms of having come out and spoken very publicly and critically against a very large piece of urban infrastructure, the West Connects project. So this kind of disciplining and the bounding of expert knowledge so that it stays on track with what the broader normative goal is around delivery of said project and how problematic that is in terms of advocating for good public interest or public outcomes, whatever they might be. So in the neoliberal context, such professional work of knowing and speaking to impacts and the political work of advocating for just outcomes has overwhelmingly been limited to the technical and addressed through the managerial processes. And even the economic aspects of transport planning have borne little consideration in decisions, as transport infrastructure projects are approved with neither sound business cases nor clear articulation of costs and benefits. And looking again to Australia and the work of one of our large think tanks, the Grattan Institute, they have described a landscape, and trying to understand what's going on, have described a landscape that makes reform under current conditions challenging and where reformist policy, where it might peek its head, is plagued by a weakening of the public service and of independent agencies that can produce advice based on an evidence base. This weakening of public and independent oversight has led to the empowerment of ministerial advisors over the frank and fearless advice offered by public servants. And this has led to the erosion of controls regulating decision makers, of eroding controls that might manage and soften political parties' politicization of planning, as well as of controlling and limiting the impacts of vested interests. So whether this disavowing has led to a reckoning of sorts in planning remains a compelling and open question for us. Yet it could be argued that in some quarters, critical reflection has begun. A rejection of the Victorian transport planning system by long-standing transport engineer William McDougall laments, after being removed from working on a large mega road project in Melbourne that he critiqued internally within the formal planning process, he writes, and I will quote directly, "I hereby refuse to associate myself with Victoria's state government anymore. I strongly encourage my fellow practitioners to join me in revolt and stop selling themselves out to a dysfunctional system. Our energies as a profession should instead go towards sorting out this mess," end quote. McDougall's call joins a powerful critique from Australian transport planning scholar Kerry Curtis, who articulated in a chapter in this book, Never Again, Reflections on Environmental Responsibility after the very controversial Row 8 project was cancelled. I quote from her commentary in that chapter: "The events of the summer of 2016 and 17 caused me to feel ashamed to be a planner, given the abuse of process that occurred in the hands of some planning bureaucrats. Curtis felt, and I quote, let down as a citizen because the planning strategy which she expected to be implemented was being ignored. And that as an academic, she felt that she had, and I quote, wasted 30 years of her life researching and teaching sustainable transport, when those responsible for Row 8 could simply set aside a strong policy and research evidence base in order to proceed." Curtis reflected on the process and the efforts of the community campaign against Row 8, writing, and I quote again from her chapter, "Pursuing the Row 8 project was a betrayal of community trust, damaging the planning profession. There is a significant task ahead if we are to restore the public's faith in transport planning," end quote. So we're seeing here in these two examples, professional planner, professional civil engineer as well, and the planning academic sort of refusing the terms upon which planning is currently being conducted in two different state contexts, one being Victoria, where Melbourne is situated and where I live, and Perth, Western Australia. These moments of public refusal to accept the terms upon which contemporary transport planning is being conducted are rare, but nonetheless quite inspiring. Refusals of these kinds give ground to the question of refusal at wider and potentially more collective scales. Adding to the challenges described above or earlier in this presentation, planning itself is stripped of its political content through the introduction of instruments that conceal the decision-making power of the private sector. Such instruments, particularly the market-led proposal schemes or unsolicited proposals, as described by Dallas Rogers and Chris Gibson, are designed to allow private consortiums to propose mega infrastructure for building with little public scrutiny of such proposals. These instruments of planning contribute to the formalization of private sector leadership in strategic planning. They also have facilitated the bounding of decision-making arenas and restricting those arenas to those possessing elite status as powerful corporate entities. And through this access and elite status, the future course of city production is influenced. These planning instruments that facilitate elite private sector access are described by Rogers and Chris Gibson as, and I quote, those targeted and incremental amendments that are manipulating existing systems that centralize power with business interests and which evade democratic governance or critical scrutiny and thus normalize planning as deal-making, end quote. The ways in which depoliticization is enshrined in planning through these planning instruments is deeply troubling. Depoliticization is a political economic project conditioned under neoliberalism that pushes well beyond what Rogers and Gibson described as forward-looking and government-led strategic planning. That once facilitated competition and privatization, and it has evolved and emerged into something that enables the participation of elite coalitions. And in their word, this is drawing again on Rogers and Gibson, depoliticization is deepened through the active use of these unsolicited proposals. And I quote, to sidestep, rescale, and obfuscate decision-making with new in-house processes and monopolistic determinations, where new regulatory technical processes are reconfigured to make this possible, and one that privileges and prioritizes a distinct constellation of elite actors. As we know, further change is afoot in the transport space, with the rise of large global corporate actors who are claiming the spaces of transport planning as well. The technologists and the futurists in the guise of Uber, Tesla, Google, Alphabet, Meta are generating new mobility technologies that are perceived to be greener, safer, more efficient, and grounded in a platform governance that are raising challenging questions about accountability, ownership, and transparency of data, and also who gets to participate in the decision processes that will determine the future of mobility. These technologies are not just revolutionizing the way we move, they are also reshaping transport planning, particularly around questions of who is doing transport planning, what scales these practices are performed, rather from the local towards the more global, and what knowledges are privileged in these processes. While concerns for data privacy and data control remain intractable problems for us to study and understand, less focus has been given to the changing political economy of transport planning that is altering knowledge systems and determining who has access to that knowledge, as well as the spaces through which that knowledge might be challenged. So reshaping a relationship to participation, again, linking back to Patrick's presentation earlier today. For me, this raises a critical question. And the question is, to what extent is transport planning scholarship, so I'm looking inwardly now in the work that us as scholars might do. So to what extent is transport planning scholarship prepared to step into the spaces of dissent to generate new political possibilities for transport planning and future mobility? And how can transport planning scholarship and scholars like us assist in the reckoning of what and who counts and who is doing the counting? Depoliticization cannot foreclose transport planning from its political content. Rather, repoliticization is commonly observed as an act of resistance against prevailing transport planning practices and processes. Resistance against projects can reveal insights into public values, and it can expose injustices such as who is being excluded from the discussion and the narrow ways in which knowledge is created, the hegemony it holds in participatory and decision spaces, and how that hegemony is expressed in those decision spaces affecting people's mobility. To offer one example of how transport knowledge is narrowly scoped and defined, we turn to transport modeling. Often derided for being largely a black box exercise, the privileging of modeling as a knowledge creation tool available to transport planners places singular emphasis on instrumental and technical solutions. While modeling is an important tool, this knowledge is silent on the social, political, cultural, economic, and even economic variables that a society must also confront in thinking about the future city. Nor does this technical or instrumental knowledge engage with the values upon which such decisions may find guidance. Engaging with these more social questions is the domain of non-transport planners, but where and how engagement might occur is relatively non-existent. and largely occurring in tightly controlled procedural environments. The political context, the political paradox, described earlier, presents a challenging landscape for urban transport scholarship. Calls to engage with transport political economy from people like Louise Reardon and Greg Marsden is to do the work of exposing power relationships and the processes through which depoliticization is practiced and secured. In equal measure, a plethora of academic research into the processes of change in transport planning reveal future possibilities through political action and savvy policymaking. This research documents the actions and strategies that lead to projects being defeated and canceled. And this research may also draw insights into the formation of new power configurations in government and the possibilities these new configurations may create for reformist policies and transformational urban ambitions. Facing the complex challenges of climate change, which possesses ever greater levels of urgency with each successive IPCC report. And I just want to remind everyone of that powerful slideshow that Robin shared with us yesterday, and just offering that as a pause in a moment to reflect in my experience of that living in Melbourne at the time. So thinking about the ever level of urgency around climate change, and the ever-increasing spatial and social inequality in cities and regions, one must consider what is this period demanding from us as policymakers, as teachers, and as scholars. For academics, perhaps what this moment demands from us is to conduct research and to teach with radical intention, to be purposeful in a way that frames planning evidence bases, so planning's engagement with generating an evidence base, but doing so in a way that situates it within a political context that exposes how planning may be complicit to different forms of exclusion, oppression, and harm. Here I draw inspiration from the powerful work of Libby Porter, who shows how planning is complicit in cultural harm, and also other bodies of work looking at the complicity of planning around environmental degradation, and reveals the fractures and fault lines embedded within planning, particularly planning conducted in neoliberal contexts, where the pursuit of social and ecological change is often met with hostility by the structures and politics that lay before us. So intentionality in our practice, scholarship, and pedagogy may also imply joining existing community grassroots efforts. We may join these efforts in ways that allow research to serve those communities, as well as play a nurturing role that can help facilitate new practices and draw from new knowledge systems in a spirit that reflects reflexivity and reciprocity. So using transport scholarship to nurture solidarities can inspire new political possibilities and pathways towards change. Prefiguring new planning context through purposeful research, teaching, as well as policy and community engagement can expose the deleterious politics of transport planning and ambitiously support conditions for change into the future. So grounded in justice claims, solidarity-based action runs against the kind of self-interest cultivated under neoliberalism and focuses the imperatives informing one's actions around the unjust conditions of others. So solidarity formation also demands a higher degree of intentionality forged through normative goals. In urban studies, those normative goals have been multiple and may include, just by way of example, the just city, the good city, the public city, and ethics of care, place-based engagement, thoughtful and meaningful engagement with country, and of course, with each other. Drawing from long-established work in the bioethics field and the work of Lisa Eckenwilder, solidarity is characterized as, and I quote, reaching out through moral imagination and responsive action across social and/or geographic distance and asymmetry to assist other people who are vulnerable and to advance justice. In short, solidarity is about building a constituency through which to resist and to refuse. Through the establishment of such collectivism, build understanding of those actors practicing in common towards political change. There are connections to be made through political action generated by solidarity in times of complex crises. Under neoliberal economic austerity, such as the years following the global financial crisis, solidarity networks and movements typically arose in demand for greater equality, to make visible urban fragmentation, or in response to contexts of oppression. Solidarity movements can represent forms of bottom-up collective provision within vacuums of institutional care and welfare. They can also set the conditions to collectively assert political demands for justice, such as community recognition or liberation. Solidarity can also be a principle for meaningful recognition and action founded on shared or similar injustices. It may invoke empathetic engagement with and enact responsibility towards the political interests of others. This empathetic engagement involves, and I'm quoting from the work of Petra Teskert, confronting layers of shared vulnerabilities and histories of silencing and erasures. So this is some of the work of this empathetic, led, and motivated solidarity building. So looking to the work of Elizabeth Wamturi, communities' solidarity within and across groups is strengthened through collective processes. These collective practices engender a sense of empowerment, and they involve large or small democratic experiences of forging futures, such as organizing together for political ends or social provision. Expressions of solidarity are also seen through collective resistance to harmful policies, such as infrastructure approaches that represent unjust outcomes for vulnerable groups. For example, new coalitions of political anarchist groups and Indigenous communities resisting pipeline projects in Canada, or of an expanding freeway in Victoria, Australia, on unceded Indigenous lands, help to redirect the anger of certain groups towards common structures and institutions, bringing them into solidarity with the aims of decolonization in this instance, as Kay Bosworth suggests and writes. This perspective characterizes solidarity practices as processes of relationship building, political reorganization, and future visioning, as new commonalities are forged through political alliance. But there is some contention around the concept of solidarity and the conditions that nurture it. For instance, returning to the work of Kay Bosworth, they disagree that solidarity needs to be based on common experiences and instead posit that, and I quote, alliance and solidarity across difference can shift the horizons of the possible, including through negotiated arrangements based on principles of respect that connect cultural, plural concerns and struggles. Solidarity can also be enacted through a sense of ethical responsibility to use one's relative power and privilege to support others within politically entangled relationships. To act in solidarity with others is an attempt to create collective empowerment through expanded relations and aligned goals, and to overcome boundaries of personal or group self-interest. To intentionally enact practices of solidarity generation through transport research and policymaking, it is important to reflect on what makes solidarity meaningful and powerful. While solidarity principles are conceptually intertwined with the notions of representation and advocacy, more central to recent understandings of solidarity practices is to align one's own actions with the political interests of others, including some personal sacrifice when necessary. So acting in solidarity with others involves questioning for whom and what purposes one practices serve and what relations of power they help or fail to legitimize. This notion also implicates understanding whose interests are excluded or whose interests you are acting against, such as powerful players with unethical interests. The arenas of placemaking and governance are often seen as an important and fertile space for nurturing solidaristic relations over time, as a central terrain for care, health, and collective bonds. Transport research and policy can also be grounds for solidarity practices. So in the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, for example, many challenging questions around social economic care, collective urban interdependencies, and collective commitment to different forms of immobility in cities have come to the fore in public debate. Engendering solidarity around how we live and move in cities have potentially opened unexpected windows for change by calling into question existing assumptions about possible futures. And I'm citing here from the work of Natalie Osborne. Going further, the ethos of solidarity enables radical bottom-up urban change around new mobility practices that can be understood at the level of individuals and collectives, and through to the development of a sense that the urban and our experiences within it is not fixed and can and should be transformed. Similarly, drawing out new understandings of mutual interdependencies and obligations around movement can forge new political commitments and future orientations, and potentially challenge the hegemonic narratives of future transport policy being predicated on responding to emerging technologies over new ways of moving and living in cities. The creation of transport policy and politics that is grounded in place-based research methodologies can be a productive space for solidarity formation. For instance, as a feminist research approach, situated solidarity is engaged scholarly activism rooted in reflexivity and positionality of the researcher, and by extension, the planner. It is proposed as a way of locating political struggle in place and reflecting on how academic resources and policymaking can be mobilized around the questions relevant to grounded social justice movements, and then scaled up to inform urban and transport policy. Beyond traditional diagnosis and analysis, this solidarity-based approach seeks to meet people where they are, learning and listening openly to experiences of struggle and transformation situated in place context, and forging new alliances and commitments through engaging with conflicts and contradictions to seek, and now I'm quoting from Wendy Lerner's work, workable compromises. Here, transport research and policy are grounded in the everyday experiences of diverse communities, which can be imagined as an entirely radical form of planning that shifts from the depolitical policy arenas described earlier in my presentation, while dismantling the power wielded by those with elite access to policymaking and decision makers. In seeking practices of solidarity in the transport arena that can meaningfully contribute to just outcomes within placemaking and research contexts, it is important to be mindful of structural limitations to, or cynical manifestations of solidarity. There can be gaps between the rhetoric of solidarity among communities impacted by transport decisions and the actual capacities to act collectively or in the interests of others in more precarious contexts. Facades of common interest or camaraderie across different geographies of the city and between planners, academics, and diverse community members can obscure actually dividing political or material interests that may simply be untested publicly. For example, performances of solidarity within place-based communities can generate ironic and contradictory behaviors among different groups that are simply displaced to different spatialities and therefore at a site. Structural forces and material interests can create critical constraints for solidarity-based movements, such as a dependence on particular sources of funding or critical ideological differences between networks. These are important tensions to be mindful of and at times to face directly in research and in policy, and particularly in complex urban transport governance and planning, which is wrought with existing unequal power relationships. Solidarity formation can be empowering and inspiring, but it also can be challenging and confronting. It can be served by optimism and also through political naivety as well. Solidarity formation as a conceptual lens is available to transport planners, scholars, and policymakers, and it raises important questions and even provocations for the field. Such formations will invite an unsettling of contemporary transport planning and the ways in which knowledge is produced and what and who is counted in those spaces. In this work, we may look to reframe transport planning as an engaged practice in the social, economic, and political processes shaping cities and regions. In doing so, reclaiming transport planning as an act of politics in its own right, and that which requires careful scrutiny as new forms of exclusion may arise and change over time. In this work, we may center solidarity formation as a conceptual lens through which to rethink the practice of transport planning and policymaking, and in a way that connects it to country, the lived experiences of diverse communities, and to climate change action. Thinking through what solidarity invites, we may also look to a recent paper by Inji John, who writes that academics have particular responsibilities to commit to active change in the public interest. In seeking to strategically reinvigorate planning scholarship's social responsibilities, Inji John puts forth a critical agenda for researchers that includes redefining the scales of the possible and pragmatic public solidarities, and in doing so, making visible the intangible values behind city making and elevating alternative values through which new urban logics can be advanced. So in these final minutes, as I wrap up, I outline several ways in which transport planners, policymakers, and scholars might embrace solidarity formation as one lens through which to generate or prefigure alternative logics, values, and practices in transport planning. To begin, reconnecting transport planning with country, place, treaty processes through partnership with Indigenous communities must be central to this effort. In Australia, transport planning is conducted on unceded First Nations lands. If we are to address the fractures and fault lines in transport governance and prefigure a more climate-just form of transport planning, settler Australians will need to self-critically ask whose transport and whose mobility are we seeking to improve and to what ends? Solidarity formation demands attention to be paid to scale. Typically, transport planning embraces aggregate information to think through the distribution of infrastructure and transport resources. Little attention is paid to the local and the lived experiences of diverse communities. To reconcile this tension and to work in efforts to build solidarities and connection with communities, ethnographic methodologies need to be explored as legitimate knowledge creating practices available to transport planning. Building closer connections with communities through ethnographic knowledge formation processes possesses the potential to cultivate new possibilities for co-designing urban transport futures. At the forefront of thinking through new practices of solidarity is to situate this work in a political context that is largely controlled through elite actors in government and by the private sector. Doing so demands a level of political participation in the knowledge generating process so that alternative and different ways of knowing transport can be actively advanced. Policy and planning academics can play an integral role in the knowledge creation process and with the relative independence granted through university employment, which can help us speak truth to power and to support the pre-configuration of new landscapes for knowledge creation. So this is my last slide. To engage with the politics of transport planning is to reckon with the structures that shape its politics. At the heart lies a deeper reckoning of the question, what is transport planning? How do we understand it? Who does it? And in whose interest? While the idea of solidarity may seem ill-suited to a discipline that has its foundations anchored in technical knowledge, across my collaborative research, we argue that solidarity possesses a political power that opens transport planning to the social processes of change and to the deeply political aspects of transport planners' work and to the diverse knowledge systems that must inform transport policies. The urgency of this agenda is clear. The climate emergency demands new forms of mobility and less carbon-intensive transport and infrastructure. This urgency is set within a changing political economy of transport planning that has given way to strategic intervention from elite actors and from global monolithic transport technologists. The historical pathways available for change, namely well-communicated evidence bases, which is what transport planning has typically relied on, do not hold enough power to ignite the kinds of and levels of change needed today. Instead, a more political form of engagement with enduring social, spatial, and cultural injustices demands recognition of the importance of different knowledges of and approaches to transport planning, as well as the roles through which policymakers and academics can play in prefiguring these new practices and processes. This revival of planning principles and politics demands a refusal of the practices and processes that continue to exclude and oppress. This moment demands bold action and forging solidarities with communities, policymakers, and with fellow transport scholars to enable this change as necessary. It needs to be grounded in the building of collective action and the establishment of new political paradigms and pathways for future urban transport and mobility. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Yeah, so welcome for any questions or comments. Colleague Denis will give you the mic. Otherwise, everyone, Eric. Otherwise, everyone who's watching via Zoom, please feel welcome to submit as well.
Hi, Crystal. Thank you very much for the fascinating lecture. I am Eric Swingedow. The question I have is what precisely you mean with politicization or the political, in the following sense. That it seems to me that what you are suggesting is that politicization occurs when communities, people rise up against the post-political techno-managerial order, that they contest what is being managed by this depoliticized configuration, and that then for the planner, the activist scholarly planner, his or her key function is to nurture the solidarities that you talked about. And I can follow you for the long way here. And of course, all your examples are the kind of examples that we all like. Question I have is the following, is what do we do with communities, for example, that in a dissensual, contesting way rise up against techno-managerial governance that wants to put an asylum center in their communities, as is in Europe and other places often the case, that local, very often marginal or poor communities rise up in a politicizing sort of way, so it seems, against the construction of an asylum center or housing for undocumented immigrants. I can also think of examples in the United States, in West Virginia or so, where communities really are activists in terms of demanding, fighting for greater coal extraction. Should Planner Act A, is that also politicization? That kind of examples that I just illustrated. B, should Planner activists also organize solidarities, etc., with these kind of forms of dissent and rupture from the political order? Or is there something else in your understanding of the political that makes it possible to choose, to make a decision as to what communities one wants to be in solidarity with and which ones not, and how one decides that?
Wow, Eric, thank you so much for the question, and what a treat to be asked a question from you. So thank you. I've been following your work for a really long time. And what a difficult question to be asked as well. And one that I have been sitting with for some time. I haven't engaged with it directly in terms of my empirical work, but I was inspired to look into the work of Chantal Mouffe about 8 years ago when I was doing work in Sydney, looking at community opposition to social and public housing. So I was out door knocking in western parts of Sydney and was deeply uncomfortable with what I was hearing in terms of the kind of exclusionary kind of politics taking place at a very localized, grassroots, community-led form, which I would agree would represent a form of politicization as well. And that the case studies I offered today were the ones that we feel comfortable with, certainly. And so in trying to work through that, one of the things that I've been being unsettled by is what would be a good way to frame it, is to think about the role of the state in the ways in which it can protect rights, in the ways in which it can protect certain battles that have been won in the past, the ways in which certain forms of consensus have been are represented in policies, for instance, and that we need to problematize, who's doing the politicization, who's performing that politics, and who's asserting what. And I'm deeply compelled and intrigued by the complexities of all of that. And so I don't have an easy answer for you, but to say that much of the sort of theoretical work that I've been inspired by has been through Jacques Rancière's and his ideas of sort of equity as a sort of a point upon which groups may act politically and may inspire a politics and a political subjectivity to emerge. And so there's something within that question of equality or inequality that I find really interesting. And even in those groups where what they're contesting is something deeply uncomfortable, whether or not there's something within that politics being performed in streets, so to speak, that can still be tapped in to inspire a public sphere of the kind that I think Habermas speaks to, a commonality rather than a constant fragmentation and a divisiveness within the polity. I don't have a straightforward answer. That's a really tough one, Eric, but thank you so much for that question. And I will continue to think that one through, I think.
Hi, my name is Sophie Michel from Drift. Thank you for this presentation. It was really inspiring. Eric started his question in the same way I was going to start and then went a whole different direction. But I really recognized the way you described the sort of transport planning regime and the incumbent structures, the depoliticization of the whole transport space. I'm sure the Australian setting is different from the Dutch. We obviously also have a more diverse transport system, but it's still very much depoliticized and technocratic, I would say. But yeah, you draw a lot of inspiration, it seems like, from social movements who then are active or become active in a transport space, or communities that offer resistance. But what I've noticed in Holland is that transport is very much depoliticized also at the local and community level. People don't really question our sort of fossil fuel car dominant system at all. And the only politicized issues, traffic jams and congestion and travel times. So I was curious on maybe your reflections on what is the role of the action researcher or the activist researcher in such a setting where we see the urgency for change from a sustainability perspective or a justice perspective, and how our communities could be improved, also in the context of placemaking, but where this activism from a grassroots level is lacking.
Thank you for that question. I wish I was there. I'd love to go out for a drink afterwards and unpack some of these great questions that are very complex. But I think one of the things that I've been doing in to try to engage with that question of depoliticization and the ways in which that the certain frames and narratives and norms that get perpetuated within the ways in which communities or people tend to situate themselves, the choice to drive the car versus getting onto the tram or ride a bike when those options are available to you, recognizing those options are not always available. So there's a politics to that, of course. I teach a subject called urban transport politics at the University of Melbourne, and what I've been trying to do in that subject is to unpack what is politics and what is political in a way that allows aspiring planners to go into their respective workplaces and to be able to read what's going on, to be able to see ideology, to be able to see something that might be a particular rationality that has found power through some some practices or processes that tend to otherwise go unscrutinized. And my goal in doing that is to set planners up so that when they go into the institutions that they may find themselves, that they do so without being naive to what's going on, and to work through that naivety, hopefully position them well to have the kinds of conversations that meet people where they are, so they can see where people are at and they can welcome conversations from those places rather than coming in with the expert knowledge. These are really tough questions, and sitting in Melbourne, Australia, where I'm located, where trying to get rid of car parking to allow a dedicated bike lane to be planned can take years of community contestation. I've done some work in Hamilton, Ontario, down the road from where I grew up, on a light rail project that has been 20 years in the making, conceptualizing, reconceptualizing, and there's this tussle, constant tussle. But what I find really inspiring in looking at examples like that, where projects are slow to emerge and be implemented, it's the tussle I find really exciting. And in the context of Australia, and in Victoria in particular, there is no tussle. And if there is, it happens in community meetings, but in the public sphere, where you might see planners coming in and advocating for the interests of communities, whichever communities they might be, politicians coming in and sitting on panels and debating with academics like myself, none of that really exists anymore in the Australian context, and certainly in the Victorian context where I am, where even getting access to decision makers for interview, for research, can be really, really hard. And that's because transport planning and infrastructure planning has become so politicized that, that no one can speak to it directly in the moments where these ideas are currently being thought through in government. And so this instrument that I referred to, this market-led proposal instrument, what it is it's a peculiar thing in the planning system whereby private actors can come up, large, well-lined private actors in consortium form can come and pitch a project. And that project is then conceived and considered within the closed doors of government. And it's not too much later on that people, the public, are known that this is going to be the project that will be implemented, which raises some serious questions in terms of not only public participation, but just basic transparency and accountability. I think I went off on a bit of a tangent there. I'm very sorry, but that was such an excellent question. I'd love to hear others' reflections if they have some insights from some of the places that they are located.
Have any more questions in the room?
Okay, prepare. It's going to be a really tough question. No fun. Tough question. As far as today is Ukrainian Constitution Day, I would like to bring your attention to this point. As far as we have many cities which are needed to be reconstructed from the very beginning, so there is no infrastructure at all in many of them, what issues can we solve in those cities which are usually more complicated to solve in those cities where the transport infrastructure already functioning and needs to be improved into less car centralized way? So how can we, what issues can we solve from the very beginning in transport infrastructure?
I think one of the main arguments, thank you very much for that question. And I think it's a big question, and it's an important question. One of the things that I'm working through in my scholarship is how to decenter the academic in these conversations around, solutions and pathways forward, and to kind of situate ourselves within a constellation of actors and community bodies that are coming to grips with the problems that they face, and kind of situating what are the solutions possible, or what are the pathways possible in the context of the place that we are in. So kind of thinking back to kind of Patrick's presentation around place-based infrastructure planning or energy transitions. I don't have an answer for you because it is really a tough one, but I think where I land increasingly so in my work is to sit in relationship with those who are having those conversations at the local level, and to conduct my research that is in relationship to the questions that they're asking, and to deliver research outcomes in a way that is useful and in relationship to those communities that inspired the work in the first instance, and may hopefully perhaps even be impacted by it in some way going forward.
Thank you so much. Any more questions in the room? Otherwise, Eric, I don't know if you wanted to. We have a question from a participant online.
Hi, it's me again, Eric. I'm back. Hi. Yes, to continue, I mean, it is very difficult indeed to figure out what politicization is. There seems to be a consensus that we're living under post-politicizing techno-managerial governance arrangements that are obscuring, disavowing, foreclosing the political. And there's also some sort of agreement that politicization somehow has to do with dissensus, resistance, disagreeing with the techno-managerial institutional configuration somehow. So there's a consensus around that. But then the question still remains open as to what politicization is. And you mentioned two very different and I think radically opposed notions of politicization. There's Chantal Mouffe on the one hand, for whom nurturing agonistic encounter is the expression of politicization. So if a right-wing fascist asshole stands up against the state, that's equally good as a politicizing agonistic encounter as a dispossessed, undocumented migrant. So she doesn't make much of a distinction between those, theoretically speaking. Compare that with Jacques Rancière, Claude Lefort, or very others, or the range of others. They would make a clear distinction, right? Politicization is not just an expression of dissent and disagreement, etc., which it is, but in the name of axiomatic equality which marks the democratic invention. Yeah? And so politicization does two things. It demonstrates the scandal of democracy, yeah, that not everyone is treated equally, yeah, as well as performing equality. So for Rancière, it's very, very clear what constitutes politicization, right? It's a demonstration of inequality and at the same time, a performativity of what constitutes an egalitarian intervention. Now, in your discussion, this notion of equality as an act of demonstration, which at the same time critiques fundamentally the scandal of the democratic institution, which is inegalitarian, that never figured in your notion of politicization. So now to come back to it, no, should we not begin to distinguish between various different conceptualizations of politicizations and then begin to think about those who are really transformative and those who, as Jacques Rancière would call it, if you were to pursue that, would only lead to the establishment of a military barrack, a school, or an exclusive community, or in other words, some forms of dissident action reinforce the very inegalitarian condition that we're in. And we certainly don't want to achieve that. So again, I'm trying to problematize this notion of politicization and be a bit more forceful as to what kind of politicization we would stand for, defend, and argue for both theoretically and conceptually, and what kind of intellectual apparatuses are out there that we can mobilize in order to legitimize and sustain and justify particular forms of solidarities, while at the same time excluding other forms of solidarities. Many of us do not want to be in solidarity with some forms of politicizing the resistance. So that's all.
Thank you again, Eric, for that. I mean, just writing lots of notes as I was listening to you speak. I think what I'm trying to work through in the work that I'm doing is that question of, you know, what kind of politicization am I talking about, you know, in the work that I'm doing? How do I sit in relationship to the work of Jacques Rancière and Chantal Mouffe, who I completely agree have very different readings and very different relationships, I understand, to the state as well. And so in thinking about that in the context of planning, which has been seen as state-led, an apparatus of the state, problematizing its relationship to the state and situating it in the context of a wider movement of politicization, again, problematizing that word, what role can it play and how does it evolve as an institution? Maybe that's an unhelpful sort of question to be asking, but it's one that I'm stuck within as someone who teaches in a planning school, and one that I still find really compelling. And I find compelling because of all the different ways in which planning has become quite hostile to even claims of equality in the context of the Australian city where I do my work. It is the question of equality and inequality that motivates my scholarship. So I think my natural alliance and affinity is for Jacques Rancière's work. And I do though wonder how I could, what the next step is. What is the next question for me in trying to move along where I currently am? And the question of solidarity is interesting. I think you're absolutely right, and I'm going to butt up against it, no doubt, going forward. I'm going to use this as a moment of unsettling to think through how do we engage with those more sort of those insurgencies or grassroots movements that aren't necessarily looking for, or maybe about something that's unequal, but it's in alignment with a different value system. I don't have an answer. I'm really quite inspired by the question though, Eric. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Yeah, it's not easy having Eric here. Yeah. Any more questions? I don't believe we have any online. I'll just check. It might be a more technical question, but maybe we got one more. Yes, it's more a technical question. If you could share the title of your paper once again, the one that your presentation built on.
Yeah, I am. The paper is currently under review, so I can certainly share it with anyone who might be interested. The title of which is on the presentation slide, which is Politicized Transport, Solidarities, and Political Possibilities in Transport Planning.
Thank you. So there is one question sort of hidden there. Maybe we can address it nonetheless. Like one aspect I found particularly interesting, the online participant Matthias says, were the gatekeeping mechanisms in the planning process. Is that aspect also covered in the paper, or do you refer to it somewhere else? Or maybe you could go a little bit into that point.
Yeah, so I've looked a little bit at gatekeeping across a number of a couple of papers, which I can share. One with Ananya Roy and Libby Porter that came out last year, looking at the questions of refusal and silencing and the hostilities of the current institutions we find ourselves working within or outside. I'm particularly looking at this question of gatekeeping in a research project that's funded through the Canadian Research Council, looking at the work of they're called the International Association for Public Participation, IAP2, which is an organization that does a lot of training around public participation for planners and people working in public policy. And within the context of that, they have a series of, drawing on Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, a series of sort of best practices around what constitutes good quality public participation. And I'm exploring this idea of gatekeeping in the context of that work around, what counts and doesn't count as good quality public participation. What does best look like, and who's defining good? And asking that question in the context of where does informal participation or citizen-led or public-led participation fit in relationship to something that is seeing something that looks like it's becoming more formal and also professionalized. Participation as a professional a track that some people may take in their careers. So this question of gatekeeping is one that I'm sitting with at the moment, and it's a new emerging sort of kind of theme in the work that I'm engaging with. But it's mostly situated in that context of these engagement organizations that have very strong purchase in Canadian and in Australian cities at the moment.
Thanks so much. I think with that, we can bring this session to a close. One more warm hand for Crystal.
Thank you very much again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.